Ladies and gentlemen, this is Gaming Technical video. We're going to be discussing Polaris again. There have been some more reports regarding the GPU's performance, the power draw of the card, heat, and also some PCB shots which have emerged onto the internet. Also during this video, I want to go through some of the other rumours and some leaks concerning the card, as well as official information, just so that you have it all in one place. Now, before we go any further, I do want to stress, just like I did yesterday, all of this information, especially when it comes to stuff like 3D Mark, take it with a grain of salt until we get the card in your hands. In other words, until it's available to either bona fide reviewers or you. Because ultimately, there are problems taking into consideration leaked benchmarks. For example, it could be old driver revisions, as in the case of AMD's own benchmarks. Ironically, that we're using slightly old driver revisions, so it's like, how did that affect performance? We don't know. And also, a lot of the time, driver revisions aren't even mentioned, and even worse than that, a lot of the time, even hardware itself isn't mentioned. So, just how genuine those scores actually are, even if they're run on genuine hardware, it's like once you start taking into account all of these unknown factors, well, you can kind of guess where we're going with this. Anyway, I want to talk about the PCB itself. Some images actually popped up thanks to the folks over at Newegg, believe it or not, in one of their blog posts. We can see that the Polaris 10, which once again is the same PCB for the RX 480 and the RX 470, essentially the same PCB. 8 memory modules, in this case is 8 gigabytes of capacity, and as we can see, one single power connector, 6-pin, and that power is split into 6+1 phases, which is not too shabby at all, really. It's actually more than the GTX 1080. So the reference board does come with 3 display ports and 1 HDMI 2. Obviously, other vendors may decide to go a different route. For example, they might decide to put in a DVI port or whatever they opt to do. Unfortunately, some information is still unknown. For example, the amount of TMUs, the amount of ROPs, and we could certainly go the same route as the Tongas, or we could go to Tahiti or some other version of the GPU and look how many ROPs are in that and make some guesswork. The problem is, because it is a very different architecture and there are some efficiencies, we don't know whether we should carry that along. As you know, the full Polaris 10 does have 2304 stream processors with a bus width of 256-bit. Polaris 11, slightly less than half this. It only has 16 compute units, which puts out about 2 teraflops, but obviously it does depend a lot on clocks. 128-bit memory bus, 4th generation GCN, and up to 2.8 times performance per watt. Polaris 10 has 36 compute units, and it's over 5 teraflops. Now, it all depends on the numbers that you want to go with, but it looks like it's very close to 6 based upon leaked clocks, which puts them at about just over 1200 megahertz. We've seen that number banded about quite a lot from various leaks. So that's not too shabby at all, and should theoretically mean that the GPU puts out an awful lot of performance. And up to, once again, 2.8 times performance per watt. And what's really interesting about all of this is we should be looking at an awful lot of memory bandwidth. It has a lot less memory bandwidth than the 390X, for example, at only about 256 gigabytes per second. But once again, it is considerably more efficient than those cards. So that's why we're starting to look at quite a lot of performance despite those facts. Now, yesterday we did see some 3D Mark scores popping out over the internet that hinted that the GPU, and this is using the old favourite of Firestrike and Firestrike Extreme and Firestrike Ultra, is scoring at around the 5700 mark and 2850, which is below that of the GTX 980 and also below that of the Nano. But more scores have appeared on the internet, so which ones you want to believe are completely down to you. They basically highlight a different set of results. They show that the 480 at 1266 megahertz is scoring with Firestrike Ultra 1.1 3432. Also, some pricing has popped up on Reddit. So these are all European prices. The RX 488GB for 250, the 4GB for 209, the 470 and 150 euros, and the 460 at just 80 euros. Once again, those are possibly placeholder prices, and it's possible that this is price gouging, or it could be there's going to be additional pricing added on top, or it could be the US gets it cheaper, or whatever. So we did know that the pricing was going to be around this anyway, and it represents ridiculously good value for money. The 460 obviously is going to be mostly for those who just want MOBA style games, but the 480, even the 4GB, is just ridiculous pricing, and the 8GB, which I think most people are going to opt for, is still quite damn cheap. I also want to discuss some other stuff regarding the virtual reality performance and all of that stuff. I had already mentioned that I think the fact that the cards are aimed at virtual reality is nice, and I think it's cool that it is. The problem with that is, and this is something I highlighted in yesterday's video, how many folks really are going to buy a £200 card or a $200 card, but then rush out and buy, let's say, an Oculus Rift? There are certainly going to be some individuals who choose to do that, and it does bring down the total cost. But I imagine for most individuals, they're not going to want to do that, unless perhaps they're cross-firing. But even so, I imagine for most people, they might want to go with the 1080. Then again, I say that, but if the Fury, if the fact that the 380s are getting very, the 480s are getting very close to the Nano in performance, maybe Crossfire 480s is the way to go, because it could represent absolutely stupendous value for money. But if you wanted to say that, I don't think it really brings down necessarily the barrier for entry in terms of virtual reality, because I think people that strapped for cash are probably not going to want to place their bets on virtual reality right now. I think most individuals who are strapped for cash are probably instead going to want to upgrade their monitor or upgrade their GPU and then hold out their cash for, let's say, something in the future. And let's face it, virtual reality headsets over the next year or two are going to get cheaper anyway. But by that point, we could have the RX 580, which would obviously represent, theoretically anyway, much better performance. Although I have already covered this in much greater depth, so you can certainly search for it on the channel. You can just type in Ashes of the Singularity controversy and it'll pop right up. I did want to mention this just in case you missed it. There were some hinky things going on originally with the 480 where it was up against the GTX 1080. Essentially, AMD had told us that the 1080 would lose to the 480. Obviously that would be the 480 in Crossfire, and they used Ashes of the Singularity to show that off. And they were right, it did lose, but the two games looked visually different. So there was a lot of internet to and froing between Nvidia fans and AMD fans and just general, like, what the hell's going on. And basically, Robert Hallock went to Reddit and he explained that there was basically a shader bug on Ashes of the Singularity with the GTX 1080. Then the developers themselves took to Twitter and they admitted, yes, there's problems with Ashes of the Singularity on the 1080. They didn't have a 1080 themselves to test. So yeah, basically the terrain just looked different on the 1080 than what it's supposed to, although the 1080 was still doing the same amount of work. So it was just basically displaying weirdly. So that was one of the controversies, but how that actually comes when we get the GPUs and whether it's the same on, let's say, if you're playing Doom, your guess is as good as mine. Finally, I want to answer a question that keeps popping up in videos. So if it's the same number of T-flops, why is GCN4 that much faster? Well, unfortunately, we don't know all of the reasoning, because obviously AMD have not, at the least at this moment, released that information. But there were some slides that popped out a while back from RTG, and these ones, if memory serves, actually came from Computex. But basically what they said is that there were numerous changes for the 4th generation of GCN. For example, primitive disk card accelerator, hardware scheduling, instruction prefetch, improved shader efficiency, and memory compression. Memory compression, pretty obvious. It just means that the data shunting around the GPU is, well, compressed. Just, if you need a visual idea of what that means, just think of using WinZip. Okay, so you're just basically shrinking that data down. It's lossless compression. Primitive disk card accelerator, all that's doing is when a scene is being drawn, anything that isn't necessarily going to be visually seen, for example, information that's being hidden by another object, primitive disk card accelerator, as far as my understanding goes, because AMD are not giving all the information yet, but it would appear that it's essentially just saying, nope, that particular part of the scene is not going to be visible. So let's say anything's out of shot, anything's hidden by another object, that type of thing. It's basically more efficient at not drawing that stuff. It's not going to affect the quality of the scene, I just want to highlight that. Instead, it's just making it so that the scene is more efficient while it's being drawn. It basically is the equivalent of you making a 5-layer image in Photoshop, but only the topmost layer is visible. So you've done all the work on the bottom 4 layers, but only the top layer is visible. That's the best way I can describe it. Hardware scheduler. It means that the GPU itself is better at scheduling workloads across the numerous shaders and components. For example, it will say, yep, it's going to keep the thousands of shaders as 2,304, I believe, on the 480. So theoretically, they're going to be more busy. It's actually, with GPUs, you want them to be as busy as possible. You want the hardware to be utilized. So you don't want bubbles in the pipeline, which is basically where one of the shaders or numerous shaders are not doing anything, because essentially you're just leaving performance on the table. Instruction prefetch, pretty much what it says on the tin. Basically the GPU is getting data from memory before it's needed. So it's basically getting that data before it needs to be processed, so it can be, well, processed faster. So you have to, it basically is just reducing the latency. Improved shader efficiency, not quite sure about that one. It's a bit of an ambiguous statement. I guess the best way to describe it would be probably the shaders are doing more work per X. So whether that's per clock or just generally, maybe they're more efficient doing it, so they're not necessarily doing more work, but they're just doing better work, or should I say more pertinent work first. So for example, let's is a really stupid, simple example. Let's say that you don't have a credit card. Let's say you've got $10 to your name, and you are outside. Well, you can't go to the shop without getting the money, right? So you have to go into your house, go get the money, then go to the shop. So what it is basically saying in this equivalent is that you're going to your house first, and in this case the shaders would make sure that they're being efficient, that you would be going to the house first, then going to the shop, rather than going to the shop, realizing, oh shit, I don't have money, then going back to your home, then driving back to the store. That's pretty much what I'm saying. But whether that is the case, or whether they're doing more work, or whether it's a combination of A and B, we don't know yet. Hopefully AMD do provide more information on that. But yeah, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. For example, 4K decoding, DisplayPort 1.3, which obviously is going to be quite nice for those who do. AMD have also really pushed a lot of work on to HDR rendering, which is interestingly what Microsoft are talking a lot about over the past, actually it was since the DirectX conference, back at Build, they mentioned that they want to start really pushing HDR rendering. Robert Halleck mentioned this as well, that they believe that the adoption rate of 4K displays is going to be quite fast. The great thing about HDR is that engines already do render in HDR, and then basically you've got the GPU and the monitor and all that stuff will map tones appropriately. So I've already been through this a couple of days ago, so I don't want to go through the whole thing all over again. But all that basically means is that a GPU and the game the game engine, the GPU, and the monitor will all sync up in knowing that an appropriate color. So, for example, if you're looking to put out a 255 RGB image, so it's full green for the sake of argument, then the monitor knows that, the game engine means that the developer wanted you to do that, and the engine will put that out. So HDR, high dynamic range, means that you get a much wider gamut of colors on screen, and so blacks will look blacker, you'll get fewer random grey gooby colors, and you'll get much whiter colors, which is really important for space battles and all that stuff. Anyway, I think that's just about it. I think we've gone over a lot of the questions that I've been getting recently and given you a whole lot more information besides. So hopefully you found the video useful. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.